Welcome to our lecture today by Richard Bushman. This is part of the research conference of the Office of Civic Engagement Leadership. We've had a couple of panels this morning, and we also have a couple more after this, and those will be located there in the next room over. The first panel will be a BYU faculty panel, and it will include Jay Monrowan from English, Curtis Child from Sociology, and Lisa Argyle from Political Science, talking about their research that relates to civic engagement. And then we will have, after that, another panel. And this will be a student panel where three students from Sociology, Anthropology, and Political Science will be presenting. So you are welcome to attend those next door. It is a pleasure to have Richard Bushman here, and let me just make an introduction. He is the premier historian of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints today. He has been studying Mormon history for several decades. He is currently the Governor Morris Professor of History Emeritus at Columbia University. He taught at BYU. He told me back in the 1960s with Ernest Wilkinson as the president. Those were days, very memorable days, I'm sure. Brown University, Boston University, Harvard University, University of Delaware. He's taught at several places. He was the chair of the history department at the University of Delaware. His first book was From Puritan to Yankee, Character and the Social Order in Connecticut, 1690 to 1765. His book, Joseph Smith and the Beginnings of Mormonism, came out in 1984. And I remember reading that at the time, and it very much spurred my interest in Mormon history. He's written extensively on early American history, very much on Mormon history, or what we used to call Mormon history. He wrote Mormons in America, which came out with Oxford University Press in 1999. He co-edited Believing History, Latter-day Saint Essays with Reed Nielsen and Jed Woodworth. His most noted book, particularly more recently, has been Joseph Smith, Rough-Stone Rolling, which I would highly recommend to anyone who has not yet read it. He's been a fellow in various places, Brown University, Huntington Library, American Council of Learned Societies, among others. He was the president of his Society for Historians of the Early American Republic. He was president of the Mormon History Association. He has just a long record of service in providing historical understanding to so many audiences, and I am personally very grateful that he has come and been willing to speak, and I'm going to turn the time over to Richard Bushman.
Well, thank you, Richard. It's a delight to be here in this beautiful building, light pouring in from all sides and emanating from you towards the stand. I responded with great pleasure to Richard's invitation to speak to this conference on civic engagement. As I told Professor Davis, in recent years I've been getting more and more interested in Joseph Smith's own civic engagement, and welcome the opportunity, he provided the topic, to offer my views on the subject. I have come to believe that it is our obligation as Latter-day Saints to be engaged in government and public enterprises. And that if the Latter-day Saints were true to Joseph Smith's legacy, Provo would be the best governed town in the United States. I make these assertions with a record of virtually no civic engagement myself. The high point of my active political life came when I ran for student body president in Washington High School in Portland, Oregon. It has been downhill from then on. When Ben McAdams who was then a law student at Columbia University, told me he planned on going into politics as his first job, I was stunned. Perhaps eventually at the end of a career, but so soon, while he was still in the prime of life, it really seemed like a perverse decision. Some of you may be aware of G. Wesley Johnson's extensive study of the Utah diaspora, that is, of Latter-day Saints moving out of the homeland into other parts of the country. Many of these church members, Wes found, had successful careers in business, government, or academia, but almost none became civically engaged in their new homes. They worked hard at their businesses or their academic work, helped build up the church, but postponed active involvement in their communities until they returned to Utah. Civic engagement did not come naturally to them. Well, why should this be? Why should Latter-day Saints hold back in politics when they are so ambitious in other aspects of life? I think the situation is improving, but people like Ben McAdams are still rare. The fact that an Office of Civic Engagement has been organized is an indication that students need to be encouraged, perhaps prodded, to do more. The scriptures, the history of the church, and the example of our founding prophet certainly gives us reason to value public life and politics. The Book of Mormon is a thoroughly political book. Nephi and Lehi are rulers of their people. Nephi becomes the king of his fragment of the Nephite nation. The governing plot in the book, the contentions between the Nephites and the Lamanites, is over the right to rule. Much of the action in the book takes place in royal courts. The prophets are never far from the chief judges or the monarchs. Some of the prophets themselves are kings or judges. Mormon and Captain Moroni are military leaders. Major political figures appear on nearly every page. Moreover, the well-being of the people, the book repeatedly insists, depends on the righteousness of the rulers. The structure of Ether's history of the Jaredite nation turns on whether or not the kings were righteous. Ether measured the period by the godliness of the monarch. King Mosiah went further to say that under a monarchy, the whole nation's righteousness was affected by the king's temperament. The people were happy under a good king and miserable under a bad one. The reign of King Noah illustrated the point dramatically. Mosiah instituted a massive constitutional change to check the evil influence of bad kings. He wanted all the people to be responsible for the well-being of the nation, and that had required a change in the constitution of government. These are weighty philosophical judgments, not the sort of thing you would expect from Joseph Smith, but it was deeply ingrained in the text. Politics matter, and righteous politics are essential to a good society. Why then should not Latter-day Saints take on the responsibility of helping create righteous politics in their communities? Certainly, their distinctive scripture gives them every incentive. Or take the verse in Doctrine and Covenants 98, 9, and 10. When the wicked rule, the people mourn. Wherefore, honest men and wise men should be sought for diligently, and good men and wise men you should observe to uphold. Should not Latter-day Saints present themselves among the number who attempt to meet this standard? Ben McAdams had plenty of scriptural reasons for going into politics. Beyond the scriptures, Joseph Smith's experience would point us in the same direction. In the first few years of the church's existence, Joseph had little to do with government. He had a few brushes with the law and was pulled into court from time to time, but he did not value government power or seek to use it for his own ends. But once the saints encountered large-scale persecution in Missouri, he came to view government as essential. Facing popular wrath that repeatedly drove the saints from their homes, he realized that his only recourse was to government. He needed the government to intervene on the saints' behalf as the only protection available against the anger of the citizenry. He appealed to the courts, to the governor, finally to the president, although to no avail. No government agency intervened on behalf of the church members, save an occasional militia general and a few politicians seeking office. It infuriated Joseph that government was impotent in the face of popular opposition. Yet he returned to the halls of government time after time in hopes of soliciting support. Never successful, always frustrated, often furious, he was on his way to Washington in 1844, just before his assassination, hoping, if he got there, to mobilize political support. Frustrated in all of these attempts, rather than becoming cynical, Joseph Smith ran for president in a desperate attempt to mobilize American government on behalf of his suffering people. By the time of his death, Joseph was teetering on the edge of cynicism and about to give up on the United States. But he never quite got there. He never lost hope. Brigham Young did give up on government and led the saints to a barren region beyond the reach of his enemies where they could make a government of their own. Joseph died believing in the United States government. He understood government as the best protection against the downtrodden and persecuted. What he valued most about the Constitution was not the balance of powers, as we often say, but the First Amendment guaranteeing religious liberty. He saw government primarily as a shield, but there was in his thought potential for a more expansive role. There are hints that he saw righteous government as potentially a positive force, more than a shield. One of the distinction features of the Restoration movement was its extension beyond the ecclesiastical. In April 1830, Joseph Smith organized a church, essentially on a plan borrowed from the Methodists. There were to be elders and teachers and quarterly conferences to which the officers were invited, much on the Methodist pattern. But then, 6 months after the church organization, Joseph received another revelation that completely transformed the movement. He was instructed to build a city and construct a new society. He was to form a Zion, a new Jerusalem, on radically different principles than governed American society. The city of Enoch was the model. And the Lord called his people Zion because they were of one heart and one mind and dwelled in righteousness, and there was no poor among them. That revelation set Joseph Smith off on a new course of reorganizing the economy and reorienting people's motivations with radical utopian goals in mind. In the first decade of his ministry, this was Joseph Smith's compelling ideal. Zion was his favorite subject, one of his friends said. He made immense exertions and took great risks to bring Zion into existence. When the gathering led almost inevitably to political conflict and expulsion, some of his friends recommended that he suspend the practice, which would mean the practice of gathering, which would mean giving up Zion. But he refused. The Zion ideal was at the heart of his endeavor. In Nauvoo, the stringencies of reformed economic order were abandoned. There was no attempt at redistributing property as there was in Missouri. That did not prevent Joseph Smith from believing they could still make Nauvoo a city on a hill, a model of civic virtue. The pressure to build a grand hotel, the Nauvoo House, was based on the need for accommodations where people from around the world could come to observe an ideal city in operation. Nauvoo was to be the paragon of tolerance of all religions and of civic virtue in all its forms. Zion has taken various forms over the years. In Nauvoo, it was reduced to a form of communal layout and extensive cooperation rather than of reformed property. Later in Utah, instead of a central city, as Zion was in Missouri and Illinois, it became a collection of villages where the saints could gather and dwell. Now, Zion is an assemblage of wards and stakes, primarily ecclesiastical in nature and scarcely economic or political at all. But behind these various formats of Zion, the ideal of a good society remains. How it will be achieved, we can only guess, but it remains a force in Latter-day Saint thinking and an incentive to make every community in which we live a partial version of Zion. We know Joseph Smith was a city planner of the first order, and to be true to his thought, we must think of societies, town governments, and a beneficent social order, not just a church. That is why I say Provo should be a model city for all the world to admire and emulate. And not just Provo. The ward was initially a political division in the city. The early saints saw wards as units for distributing welfare to the poor and performing other temporal functions. They still inhabit some of those same purposes. One of the bishop's primary duties is to administer relief to the poor. In our Manhattan ward, we have extended this function to mobilizing crews to serve in a soup kitchen in a neighboring church. It is conceivable that wards could collaborate with city governments and relief agencies to improve the quality of life for our most needy citizens. They could inch back into the civic role they initially occupied. We see some of that going on in Salt Lake City today. The historic Zion would then serve as a model for a good society and a righteous politics. Righteous is not a word that goes down well in modern political discourse. No candidate would advertise herself as a righteous person. Certainly not a Latter-day Saint, who is always in danger of appearing smugly self-righteous. Anyway, it is dangerous to even admit you pray about your work. It would be nearly fatal to claim you stand for godly principles, even though Latter-day Saint candidates may believe they do. We can scarcely make claims to practice a righteous politics even within our own churches. I have heard Republican partisans hint at their belief that their party principles are closest to God's ways because the preponderance of Latter-day Saints register Republican. That assumption may hold true in rural Utah towns and perhaps some well-off suburbs, but not in downtown Salt Lake City, and certainly not Manhattan, where I live. Republicans have to keep their heads down in my ward. A Trump partisan would have a hard time in priesthood meeting. We scarcely dare talk politics at all. It is so divisive. We don't want to offend each other or drive a dissident out of the church. How then can we claim that the planks of one party are more godly than the principles of another party? Can we really say that either the Republicans or the Democrats are more godly than the other? This division within the church has the effect of undermining our political convictions. We cannot claim to practice a righteous politics based on our policies when our own brothers and sisters disagree with us. We may wriggle around this dilemma in some way. Doubtless many candidates believe they are doing the will of God in taking a stand. but they can't offer full-throated claims of this sort without offending someone who lives in their very own ward. Wherein then lies the righteous path? How can a Latter-day Saint running for office think of himself or herself as fulfilling God's will or pursuing righteous ends? In what ways are we building the kingdom of God, Zion, in seeking office? I think this is important not only for doing a good job when we're elected, but in finding the motivation to run. Latter-day Saints respond to calls, the sense that they are doing God's will. If we thought that running for office and holding an office in government served a higher purpose, more Latter-day Saints would be moved to run. One way to bring Zion and politics together is to begin at a most unlikely place, electoral politics. It is a strange starting point because here church and civil government seem farthest apart. In the church we have no elections. Everyone is called and appointed. Anyone who seeks office to be the Relief Society president or the ward clerk is considered out of line. We make jokes about how to avoid getting called to a church position. My son used to say that his method for avoiding a call as a bishop was to wear a sweater to church each week. It did not work. He was still called into a stake presidency, despite his sweaters. Because there are no elections and everyone is called, we seek to eliminate politics from church government. We want to avoid the pushing and shoving, the maneuvering, the deals, the naked ambition, the coalitions and alliances, the bad-mouthing. When people say they wish the church was more democratic, I ask them, would you like church government to be more like the United States Congress? For the most part, the title of politician is not an honorable one in our society. We discredit actions we do not like by saying it was politically motivated. We think of politicians as people who cannot be trusted. They will say one thing and do another. They are slippery, devious, untrustworthy. I am more sympathetic to people in office than those who deride politicians in these terms. I think there's a reason why politicians are accused of speaking out of both sides of their mouths and sometimes seem slippery. They are charged with an extremely difficult task. They have to bring people together to take action for the public good. We know our society is contentious and riven. People strongly hold quite different views. They have their own interests to protect and embrace opposing beliefs about marriage, birth, and the Constitution. Politicians have to form, out of this turbulent melee of contending views, a majority who will vote for them in the first place and ultimately back measures to be passed in Congress. They have to form majorities where there are only contentious minorities. That is hard work, to get people to work together who think quite differently about just about everything. Politicians have to fashion language and policies that will somehow satisfy these contending factions and form a majority. Small wonder they sometimes appear slippery, being one thing to one group and something else to another. They have to stretch language and sometimes wiggle and squirm to avoid offending one branch or another of their constituencies. But it is in the nature of their job and their chief task in our democracy to bring people together in order to govern. How can that burden which we lay on our politicians possibly relate to the church and Zion, especially when the church is authoritarian rather than democratic, and the ethos and the atmosphere is so radically different? I wish to propose in a somewhat utopian and idealistic spirit that Latter-day Saints are particularly well prepared to bring people together. Embedded in the very core of our church and our beliefs is the injunction to unify, to work together. It is not only in our doctrine, but ingrained into our social organization. Our teachings and our practice from the ground up prepares us to show people how to collaborate, the very thing politicians are called upon to do. There are two parts to our political culture which we must consider in view of this question. One is the profound injunction in the 121st section of the Doctrine and Covenants about how we are to govern. It was written while Joseph Smith was still in prison, accused of treason for resisting the mobs that were attacking his people in Missouri. When Joseph had experienced firsthand the powerful misuse of power, he wrote in a letter to his fleeing people, "No power or influence can or ought to be maintained by virtue of the priesthood, only by persuasion, by long-suffering, by gentleness and meekness, and by love unfeigned, by kindness and pure knowledge, which shall greatly enlarge the soul without hypocrisy and without guile." These verses then go on to say that governing in this way, thy dominion shall be an everlasting dominion, and without compulsory means it shall flow into thee forever and ever. The scripture says that people will willingly unite behind this kind of leader. They will not have to be forced to go along. They will support this kind of leadership without being compelled. I think it is a remarkable passage for extending the Christian ethic and love and respect directly into the government sphere. Smith acknowledged the evils of power. We have learned by sad experience that it is the nature and disposition of almost all men. As soon as they get a little authority, as they suppose, they will immediately begin to exercise unrighteous dominion. But then goes on to extend the ethic and love and kindness to the problems of dominion and government. The Christian rules apply where power is exercised. Those words, familiar to every Latter-day Saint, infuse our thinking about the exercise of power. But they do not remain mere words. We are called upon to make them work in the small bits of governance we are called upon to do in the church. Because in their congregations, Latter-day Saints have no clergy, only lay leaders govern the church. Every member is given multiple opportunities in the course of a life to govern in a small way. Run a primary of young kids, or a congregation, or the women of the ward, or all the elders, or some larger or smaller group. The church is literally self-governed. Without a clergy and very few paid workers, the people themselves run things. We don't even have janitors anymore. The people clean the church. No secretaries, no paid musicians, no paid pastors. It is a lay organization. This puts heavy responsibilities on these church officers. How is a bishop, fully in charge of a congregation, to rally its members to do their jobs? Perhaps when he has less education than some, no experience in running anything, no ecclesiastical training, perhaps not a college degree. The bishop or the Relief Society, the Elders' Quorum president or the primary president learn on the job that kindness and love is the only thing that works. You have no other leverage over the congregation who you work with. Young kids grow up with bishops and teachers and quorum leaders who have learned to treat each other this way because it is the only way that works. You have to be kind and loving to get anything done. There are no alternatives. If you try any other methods, the people back away, don't do their duties, and you get released. In every church, every pastor, in every denomination, not just Mormons, every pastor learns this in his or her congregation. But in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, all the members learn governance by kindness because they run the church. I'm not contending that the Latter-day Saint way is unique or superior, only that everyone learns by practice. Goodwill infuses the congregations because there are no alternatives. In Manhattan, we see young women move to the city, some with husbands, some without. They look sweet and modest, but I know that within those young women is a capacity for organization and action far beyond what you would expect. You could make any one of them Relief Society president, and they would make the organization hum. They would rally the sisters, do good works, deal with conflicts and fears. They know how to do these things because they have seen them all their lives. Each one has the capacity to govern in the scriptural way because they've seen their mothers and their sisters and their bishops do it. I wish to argue that this background and training uniquely prepares Latter-day Saints to be peacemakers, to bring people together in good causes. They have seen their parents and ward leaders do it all their lives from their very first memories. They practice the same art themselves when they are called to office in the church. Can these skills be carried over into politics? I can say no more than I hope so, but I would like to say more. I would like to say that it is a reason for us to go into politics where we can experiment with governing by goodwill, as I will term this method. I'm saying that the godliness, the righteousness we seek to inject into government is not the particular policies on which we are likely to disagree, but on our method, how we govern, rather than what we enact. Our aim should be to convince others that we seek only their well-being, not our own advantage. This attitude should not only be the rhetoric of the political hustings, but the way that office staffs are managed, how all our personal relations work. Kindness and pure knowledge should prevail everywhere. There are many people of goodwill in the earth. Latter-day Saints do not have a monopoly on the principles voiced in Doctrine and Covenants 121, but we are well trained in the practicalities of embodying these principles in everyday life. We learn to govern this way in the church from the time we are young. We, above all others, should make them a reality in our everyday lives and so provide a rallying point for others who yearn for a society based on kindness and pure knowledge. Will this method of presenting ourselves actually rally disparate factions and enable politicians to form majorities and so govern the nation? Results are not guaranteed. Politicians will be sorely tempted to resort to the harsh language of the street fight. It is a struggle that will meet many setbacks, but we as a people are better prepared than others to keep up the struggle because we know it works. We have seen it function in our congregations. We have practiced it and seen the results. We can give others courage because we are less likely to give up. The New York Times columnist David Brooks has noted that people who thrive in a globalized information economy have the ability to navigate incredibly diverse social environments. Where do people learn these skills? Brooks asks. They learn them when they grow up and are nurtured by rich social networks. They learn them when they live within vibrant institutions that pass down practices and habits. They learn them when they live in areas of high social trust, when people are able to reach out and work together. I think that is what Latter-day Saints have to offer to the political world. People who have grown up in rich social networks, living in areas of high social trust. It is a gift we should bring into the politics of our cities and our nation. Thank you. So Richard said there's a time for a few questions if anyone wants to floor one. Yes, sir.
Early on, you were talking about why it seems members of the church might be reticent to get involved. I wanted to just ask your reaction to the thought that it might have something, it might be a sense of passivity. It comes to feeling that with this inspired constitution in place, everything is predetermined to work. You articulated a little bit of the skepticism, whatever, just the reticence Joseph Brigham had about the thickness of the Constitution. But in the culture that we're part of, there is this sense of a perfect framework that may, as they say, conduce to a sense of passivity, of the need to get involved. It's such a perfect system, it's we don't have.
I'm not sure I understand that question. You're implying because we believe in the Constitution, we think all is well, and no effort is needed. But isn't it evident that all is not well? And that would, why do we keep wanting to use the word Trump? And that would overcome any sense we have of, I think maybe the answer is to read the newspaper every day, and that would certainly dispel any sense of complacency. Yeah, right behind then.
So I'm curious to know from your New York perspective how Utah is viewed as a polity on the national stage. I'm in the governor's office. I work for Governor Gary Herbert. And when I attend national meetings of the National Governors Association and Council of State Governments, inevitably Utah is seen as a beacon in the nation, as on a number of different fronts in terms of policy, performance, economic performance, and so on. Those aren't just bragging rights for the governor's office. It's something that's recognized around the country. When you sit down at a table and they hear you're from Utah, they say, tell us more. Why is Utah doing so well in these different ways? And typically what comes up is a discussion about collaboration and lack of polarization in Utah. And sometimes people want to pin this on homogenization, but from your comments, it sounds like you're saying that we are well tutored in the means of collaboration. Anyway, I could show you a number of different instances where this comes up, but I'm just curious how you see it from your perspective. If Utah does help represent in some way, although not Mormon politics, politics certainly influenced by a Latter-day Saint culture of collaboration.
Yeah, I think that's true. Newspapers have spoken well, the Utah economy, various compromises have been made. The interesting thing is I think very little credit is given to the church for that. And instead, when the church gets involved, it messes things up. Then the marijuana case becomes a problem, or whatever happens to be on it. So that, yes, I would say Utah looks good nationally, but I'm not sure that Mormon culture is given the credit it probably deserves if everything I've said has any merit at all. Yeah. Lisa.
Well, I was just thinking about another reason why we may not get involved is that we're just we already have our place to serve.
think that's absolutely true. Are you civically engaged? I know legislative president, all this time, all this effort, so how can I run to the school board at the same time? And I think that is related to the response of people in West Johnson's diaspora group. That when you get out there, you work hard in the church, but you don't take responsibility for the whole society. It's just essence. We will do things right. And what we have to do is develop a little larger sense. All we think of is we'll convert you to the church, and then all will be well with you. But we're at a transition point where we're realizing that is not enough. We have to think largely of taking responsibility for the well-being of the world. And of course we're moving in that direction fairly rapidly, but we've still got some distance to go. David?
Richard, I wanted to ask a question that I will phrase in a provocative way, maybe more provocative than I mean for the sake of discussion, but you can imagine a counter story to what you told about what people learn in their ward that they might bring outside of the ward into the civic realm. Maybe what they learn is that men and women should be separated. And maybe what they learn is a reinforcement of hierarchies that along class lines, for example, that exist at the ward level that might infect their thinking when they go out into the civic realm. And what I mean by that is you made a reference to the bishop not having a college education, but we know in practice, usually the leadership of a ward is more likely to be the more educated cadre within the ward. They're often the higher income folks. Certainly that's the case in Indiana where I live, where the bishop's almost always a physician or an attorney and serving a more working class group. And just the very fact that, as you mentioned, there isn't really any democratic decision making done in the church, and there's very little transparency, there's financial transparency like that. So I wonder if maybe the story is that Mormons learn a certain way of behaving in the ward, but then when they go out in the civic realm, they find it very difficult to translate what they have experienced at church in the world, because the world is very different.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's quite true. Some of the things you mentioned, I think, are more important than others. One is that we're not accustomed to hurly-burly. If we get into a situation where there's contention, we shrivel up. We don't know what to say. Because in our ward councils or our presidency meetings, we don't encounter that. And so we are repelled, or we don't know how to function. One result is we get too mad. We don't have the patience to work our way through that. So in some ways it's not preparing us for what we should do. And I don't know quite what the answer to that is. But the fact is that all of us in our work situations face contention of one sort or another. Faculty meetings can be horrendously contentious, and over the silliest, smallest little items you can imagine. So I think there is a skill there that we definitely have to learn. On terms of social differences, the world is filled with social differences. We count on them every day of our lives. So I think we're pretty good at working around those problems.
What can we, meaning the people in this room, do to become more civically involved? Like if I, as a student here, if we were to ask you, what are 3 things in the next 6 months that I can personally do to become civically involved? What are some suggestions you would have?
Yeah. I don't do practical things. There are experts here. Richard Davis will give you instructions, and you just sign up for his office hours and tell you how to do it. I think one thing is you should always read the newspapers. You should really immerse yourself in politics. So at the dinner table, instead of just talking about the football game, you talk about what's going on in Washington. It should become part of your mind thingy. It should be discussed over the dinner table. I talk to my Jewish friends. They grow up living and breathing politics. It's what their life is about. In my household, we never talked about politics. It all seemed a little bit beside the point. We have to invest ourselves in that political. And then we have to start thinking. We have to think, not just absorb, but say, well, what would I do under those thinking? You want to know what organization to join. It doesn't hurt to go to precinct meetings. And my wife and I had an assignment in Harlem where we started going to various meetings of just local citizens for one purpose or another. Huge education, real life people really engaged. And once you feel human beings involved in it, it brings you to life.
So I have to be careful with this sitting next to work when it's staff. I'm a fairly conservative individual, but I've lived in really difficult places most of my life. So I've lived in Haight Ashbury. I've never felt the desire to go out and protest against what was going on. And I think probably most people are on the conservative side of the spectrum do. But if you look at the more left-leaning members of the church, they love to get out and stir things up and protest and things like that. In some ways, it's kind of silences the entire group of people. What's your explanation for that?
I mean, why is it different?
Do you have an explanation for why that's occurring? Why conservative members of the church tend to be fairly quiet as far as politics and aren't willing to stand up and protest? And, like a Ben Shapiro type situation. That would be so out of character for what's going on.
Yeah. Well, in Manhattan, we had a lot of our Relief Society sisters go out and make those early protests against Donald Trump's election.
That would kind of support what I'm saying.
That's good. Yeah.
But on the conservative side, they just kind of put their head down.
Yeah. Well, I'll betray my prejudices, but conservatives are so accustomed to being in power. They don't want to disrupt the power because they are dominant in businesses and everywhere else. So protest is contrary to sort of their vested interests in society.
So I just had one kind of comment and then a question. The comment was, I just wondered if you're being a little bit hard on members of the Church of Jesus Christ Latter-day Saints when it comes to political representation. I've always had the sense that we're, by numbers, we're overrepresented in political positions if you were to just look at numbers. So
That is true.
in some sense, it feels like they're, at least in that kind of political civic engagement, seems like we do pretty well. The other side of it was I wonder, I'm trying to kind of figure out what it is you're talking about with civic engagement. And you sort of talk about this openness to the community around you, and that seems to be, maybe that's partly a different thing from political representation per se, and more of engaging with one's community around you.
Yeah.
But that also, part of that is one of the pushbacks on that you mentioned was the idea of a city on the hill, right? That, for me, that always conjures an image of an ascended place that's beyond everybody else. And that seems to place some addition. It seems to push against the other move, trying to get it to suggest that we should be out in the communities, right?
Mhm.
One separates, the other is sort of more immersed.
The most preeminent use of the city on the hill in American history is John Winthrop's Arabella speech to the new migrants to Massachusetts Bay in 1629. And there, it wasn't just an ideal of a holy city that you aspire to, but creating an actual society that would embody Christian principles. He talked about being good to the poor and giving up your own selfish desires for the good of the whole. So I think we have to stick with that. I think it's true that we are out of proportion in the House of Representatives, as I understand it, with Latter-day Saints. So it's not that we're not doing it, but I'm really thinking more about the grassroots. I mean, in my own ward, do I know anyone who's really taking an active part in politics. So, I mean, we're partway there, but for us really to use our full force, I think we've got a long ways to go.
Maybe one more question.
Okay? All right?
So when you were talking about engagement, a few things popped into my head that maybe causes of that, or and I'd like your perspective. So do you think that maybe some of the historical persecution, whether real or perceived, and a perhaps doomsday, latter-day outlook, and a maybe fear of the Gentiles, do you think that has an effect on LDS involvement in politics? And so how can
Yeah, historically, as I said, though Joseph Smith wished for government aid, he didn't receive it. And so we flee the government. The government always is sort of alien. We've always been for states' rights. We don't want the federal government intervening. So it's there. But so long as we're gathering, and that's the doctrine, come together and we'll form our Zion here, this is sensible. We don't want the government interfering. But when we become global and we go out and we sort of begin to take responsibility for the well-being of the world, then it's no longer adequate to sort of separate ourselves from government. We need to, right now we form allies with all sorts of denominations, which we would never have done when I was a boy. That would have been considered you were polluting the church. It led to problems. So I think we're in the process of transitioning to sort of a global church, and that requires a whole new reorientation of our thinking. Thank you, everyone. It's good to talk to you.
I go back to that, to build off that. And I was at a conference of Latter-day Saint lenders in Buenos Aires, young people from 20 countries of South America. They were state presidents, they were bishops, they were Relief Society leaders. They started NGOs, they're working in politics.
Yeah.
And that conference was bringing together political leaders in Argentina with church leaders in South America. Talk about ways of building civil society, ways of collaborating with the church with the government.
Yeah.
Not just with other congregations. And I think that's huge. You wrote this great article about really informative.
Yeah.
I would suggest people look that up and come to understand that.
I agree with that.
Please thank Richard.